Hello and welcome back. This is the week 11 lecture. So this week we are working on essay 3. So this is very similar to what we did with essay 1 and essay 2. We are going to devote the entire week to working on the essay. So hopefully that means we can follow all of the steps of the writing process. We should have enough time starting with pre-writing here early in the week, starting with some of those early pre-writing activities, those idea generation activities that I keep talking about with these essays, just brainstorming, free writing, getting some ideas down on paper. Obviously, you need to have chosen your topics. You need to know what two subjects you will be comparing, and you just need to start, jotting down some observations, some ideas about them. You need to be doing that early in the week. That's early pre-writing. Then we move on to outlining. That's sort of the final step of pre-writing. You can also come up with a schedule, a writing schedule for the remainder of the week. You guys know your own schedules. You know when you're going to be available, when you're going to be free to write later in the week. So you need to block off some time for outlining. Of course, for drafting, you need to try to put together a rough draft by the sort of mid point of the week, maybe around Wednesday, Thursday. It would be good to have a rough draft finished by Friday, and then you have the weekend for post-writing. That means revising and editing. So let's just talk a little bit more about the essay. This particular essay, talk about the assignment details, and we'll also go through my sample outline, which is posted this week. You can look at it, you can use it. I still want you guys to create outlines of your own, but certainly, just as was the case with essay 1 and essay 2, you can use my outline. Certainly use it as a checklist to make sure that you are doing everything that is required of you in this assignment. So let's just talk a little bit about what I want here, because I do want to reiterate a few things about essay 3, because this is a different assignment, obviously, from what we've been doing before. So this is a comparative analysis, comparing and contrasting, as we know. But don't forget that we are also incorporating several other writing styles, a few other things that we've been working on these last few weeks. So don't forget about definition, don't forget about examples, and don't forget about what we did last week, classification. So I want to see those three writing strategies in the essay. So we're not just comparing and contrasting. This essay is a little more complex. We're doing more than we did previously on the first two essays. So I'm trying to remind you of that in my sample outline. You want to make sure to incorporate everything we've been doing in Unit 3. Don't just boil it down to compare and contrast and nothing else. The comparing and contrasting is the main focus. That is the base, that is the foundation for the essay, but we're doing some other things too, so we can fully explain our subjects, so we have plenty to talk about. And also, don't forget that we are making arguments here. So as I've said before, when we compare and contrast, we're not simply listing similarities and differences for the fun of it. We're ultimately using those observations, we're using that data to help us accomplish something larger. We're trying to make an argument. We're trying to prove a point. We're trying to do something that could have some value for our readers. And remember, back at the beginning of Unit 3, I said generally comparative analysis will go in one of two directions in terms of the kinds of arguments we can make using that analysis. We can either make an evaluative argument, which means we are evaluating our subjects and determining which one is better, which one is more effective in a certain way, or we can go in a more sort of explanatory direction, and our primary purpose can be to explain something about our two subjects. But push beyond the obvious. If you really want to explain something, if you want to build your argument around pointing something out, showing us something, make sure it's something that isn't necessarily obvious, something that we might not have previously known about your subjects. So that's often the type of argument you can make if you go in that direction. You can say, hey, here are two things that might appear to be similar, but in fact they have many important differences. Let me show you. Or the opposite of that, two things that appear to be quite different actually have important things in common. Or you can use your comparison to, make a different point, but it needs to be something that can illuminate something for your audience, show us something, teach us something, bring something to light that we did not previously know or maybe did not previously notice. But you have to have a higher purpose. You have to have a larger purpose than just, hey, look, there's a lot of similarities between these two things. That's not going to get you very far as a thesis. Okay, so you need to have a thesis in mind, or at least start thinking about one as you begin to work on Essay 3 here at the beginning of the week. And really the first thing you need to do, and hopefully you've already done this before watching this week's lecture, you need to have your subjects chosen. So I've given you a few different sort of categories, a few different types of things that you can use for this essay. So in the assignment directions, I mentioned you could do 2 movies, 2 television shows, 2 works of writing. That could be almost anything, short stories, poems, essays, whatever. 2 songs or types of music, 2 places, 2 mechanical or technological devices, 2 types of food or cuisines. And those are just some of the most popular and some of the most successful pairings that I've seen over the years with Essay 3. But I do mention that if you want to pick 2 subjects that fall outside of those categories, that's possibly fine. You just need to run your ideas by me and I will verify that they will work. 2 video games, 2 games will often work, whether they be video, board, or maybe athletics. As long as your 2 subjects belong to the same class and they have some interesting commonalities and differences and you can make some kind of argument about them, chances are they will work. But you want to put some thought into these subjects. Again, we're not doing outside research for this assignment, so all of the ideas, all of the knowledge really need to come from you. So these are things that you need to know about. These are some things that you need to be comfortable talking about at length. Because one thing you might notice in the assignment instructions, Essay 3 is a little bit longer than Essay 1 or Essay 2. So we are gradually increasing our length as we progress towards the end of the semester. So Essay 4 will be a little longer still. So here in Essay 3, the new minimum length requirement is 3.5 pages. So our range now is 3.5 to 5. Okay, because we have more to do. We have more writing strategies to incorporate. We have more moves to make. So this will be a slightly longer essay than the previous 2. So keep that in mind when you start planning because you need to remember that as you're outlining and, of course, as you're drafting. So another thing I mentioned in the instructions, and I want to make sure you guys notice this, is when we're constructing our comparison, we need to make sure that we are using specific points of comparison. So we talked about this back in, I think, week 8, whenever we first started Unit 3, and we were talking about comparing and contrasting. I mentioned that in order to give your comparison a structure and a sort of, framework, something that can kind of be an organizing principle, we really need to pick out 3 specific points of comparison. We're not just going to list similarities and differences. We're going to find 3 particular areas or 3 particular characteristics of our 2 subjects that we are most interested in. So remember my example back in week 8 with the 2 politicians running for elected office. How am I going to compare them? Well, they have a lot of different positions and platforms, I can easily get overwhelmed. So I'm just going to choose 3 areas or 3 characteristics of the candidates, and I'm going to focus on those 3 areas. So I think I said, the economy, education, and internet privacy. So we're going to look for similarities and differences in those 3 areas. That's how I give my comparison structure. That's how I give it a nice sort of organizational pattern that will also lend itself well to body paragraphs. As you guys can imagine, if we have 3 points of comparison, we can build our body paragraphs around those points of comparison. And that's really what we want to do. And you'll notice that is what I am doing in my sample outline. So as you're getting started, as you're generating ideas and doing that early pre-writing work early in this week, you need to start jotting down your points of comparison. You need to start listing similarities and differences point by point. You really need to start thinking in those terms. Like when you're first free writing or brainstorming, you can just write down anything that comes to mind. But as you get a little more focused, as you get closer to outlining, you really need to start thinking about, okay, what 3 specific areas do I want to look at? What am I most interested in when it comes to these 2 subjects? So if you're doing 2 movies or 2 shows or 2 books, you're probably going to pick some things that might be narrative elements, right? Because those are all narratives. They're all telling stories. So you might be interested in characters. You might be interested in theme. And you can compare the theme of the 2 shows. You can compare the characters in the 2 shows. Those would be potentially good subjects. Those would be potentially good points of comparison. But if you're doing something different, like 2 technological devices, then you're going to obviously have different kinds of points, but you're still picking out those specific characteristics, just like the characteristics of a narrative, would be characters, plot, and theme, maybe setting. The characteristics of a technological device or a mechanical device would probably be the individual parts that go into those devices. So again, like we saw with Essay 2, if we're thinking about something mechanical or technological, we are literally disassembling it, taking it apart, breaking it down, and looking at the individual parts. Whereas that's more of a figurative task if we're looking at a show or a movie. But again, with analysis, that's always what we do. We break our subjects down, we look at the individual parts, understand how they work, and then we put them back together and show or illustrate something about those objects. So it's not totally different here. So if you're doing, again, a device, something that some kind of consumer product, something that we can buy and use, you might think about, user accessibility or the cost or, some of the component parts. Those could be your points of comparison. You could look at similarities and differences in those areas. So you have to figure out the points yourself, but you should be able to come up with 3. Typically we like 3. You can have 4 if you want to go a little bit beyond 3. I would not recommend just trying to go with 1 or 2. That will probably not give you enough material. So try to develop those 3 points of comparison, and again, you can devote body paragraphs to those points of comparison. Remember, when you're planning your organization, when you start to outline, you can go point by point or subject by subject. So remember our movie examples. Let's go back to the horror movies just so I can use those as a sample topic. So remember the 2 horror movie clips that I posted back in, I think it was week 8 when we were first starting Unit 3. We had 2 movies, right? We didn't watch the entire movies, obviously, but we had 2 clips. So if I was going to write a paper, and I think I'm using those movie clips as my examples in the outline. If I was going to write a paper about those two films, comparing those two films, I could go point by point. So my 3 points are, I think, music, acting, and then something about physical space. So in my sample, I'm just building body paragraphs around those points of comparison, right? So my first body is all about music. That's my first point. So I'm going to look at similarities and differences between the films on the point of music, right? I'm focusing on music in that paragraph. So now it's easy to plan that first body paragraph. I know exactly what I'm going to be doing. I need some examples. I need to talk about music in both films. And then I move on to my next body, and that's my next point of comparison, which is acting. So now I'm doing the same thing. I'm comparing, I'm looking at similarities and differences between acting within those two films. That's my second body paragraph. And then I move on to my final point of comparison, and I devote a little bit more time to that. I actually devote 2 bodies to my final point, and there you go. Once I have my intro and my conclusion, along with those 4 body paragraphs, I should have enough to reach the finish line. So again, the points are really important. The points of comparison are important because that's how they're largely going to be how you build the paper, how you build your body paragraphs. But you can also go subject by subject. So I could have started with my first film, The Conjuring, and I could have covered all 3 points of comparison in relation to that film. Okay, so I'm going to talk about music, then I'm going to move on and talk about acting, and then I'm going to talk about physical space. And I'd have to devote multiple paragraphs to get through it all, but I'm going to start with the first film, okay, cover everything in relation to the first film, and then I could move on to the second film and do the same thing for that. Cover all 3 points of comparison. So it doesn't matter. You can go point by point or subject by subject, but either way, you're going to build your body paragraphs around your specific points of comparison. So if you don't have any points of comparison, if you're just listing similarities and differences, it will become very easy for me to tell. And not only will your content suffer, but your organization will suffer because you won't have a real structure. You're just listing things, and ultimately that's not what we want for this assignment. Okay, so do pay attention to that in the outline and make sure as you're pre-writing that you're thinking about points of comparison and you're writing some things down that you can use later. Okay, so you guys can do your free writing and your brainstorming and your clustering, all of those idea generation activities on your own. You don't need my help, but you need to be doing some of that stuff early in the week. Then you start outlining. So if you could, you can go ahead and get into Canvas, open up my sample outline for Essay 3. You can take a look at it as I'm talking. You guys should have an outline, let's say by Wednesday, an outline of your own. So then you can start drafting. Let's just go through my outline quickly. Just, this will help remind us of some of the critical things that we need to be doing. Starting with the intro paragraph. Obviously, you want to introduce your subjects, give us titles. You can also include the names of creators if that's necessary. A little bit of background info will often be necessary. Don't assume that your readers are familiar with your subjects. Oftentimes we will not be. Perhaps we've heard of them, we might be somewhat familiar, but we probably don't possess a lot of knowledge. We do not possess specialized knowledge, and that's why some of these other writing tools are going to come in handy. So after you've introduced your subjects, that should really only take a sentence or two, you can present any necessary background info. What do we need to know? What do we in the audience need to know about these subjects in order to follow along with your paper and understand your larger point? You need to ask yourself that, okay? Only you can determine that based on sort of what you know about your subjects and what you can assume about our knowledge level. Again, you have to make an educated guess. If something is commonly known, very popular, very famous, you can assume that we at least have a passing knowledge of it. But if you're zeroing in on subjects that are somewhat obscure, not commonly known, not considered common knowledge, you're going to need more background info just because we are going to be less familiar with your subjects. We're going to need to know more about them. But this is also where you can start incorporating some of these writing strategies. So as you're presenting background info and sort of giving us this introduction to your subjects, that's a good time to provide definitions and maybe to classify. All right. Now, you can do these things in your body paragraphs as well, but often these techniques are very effective to use in the intro paragraph because these are techniques that help you to explain things, help you to sort of make your subjects a little bit more concrete, a little bit more clear, and easy to understand. So you need to figure out what are your key terms. What are your key terms and concepts that you might need to define? Think about our own lessons in this class. Think about how I present new information to you guys when we move on to new units. I always provide definitions for the key terms and concepts for whatever we are doing in that week. So our comparing and contrasting week, I gave you definitions. We talked about key terms and concepts. We did the same thing when we covered definition. We did the same thing when we covered examples. We did the same thing when we covered classification. So you can use a very similar model for presenting information. Okay, you can define the words that we need to know, that your readers need to know. And remember, you can provide some stipulative definitions. In some cases, you might just want to give us a dictionary definition, that formal definition of a word that you can find in an online dictionary in a matter of seconds. But in other cases, you might want to provide a stipulative definition. Because as we know, especially when it comes to sports, games, music, mechanics, there are certain words, certain vocabulary words, unique to those disciplines, unique to those areas, and those words might have particular meanings within those areas that don't necessarily track outside of those areas. So, you guys can probably think of some examples. There's certain specialized vocabulary that goes along with a lot of specific activities, with a lot of the things that you might be choosing as your subjects. And these are words and terms that might not be familiar to everybody, or certain words might be used a little bit differently in these worlds than they are used, in everyday speech. So those are good opportunities to provide stipulative definitions, to tell us, hey, this is how I'm going to be using this word or this term or this concept. This is what it means for me. This is what it means for my comparative analysis. This is how I'm using it. Because in some cases, the way you're using it might be a little bit different from how somebody else would use that same word. So remember my example of ephemeral. We looked at the formal definition, and that's fine. We can just look that up in the dictionary, and we see all kinds of cool info, synonyms, antonyms, the history of the word. We see examples of the word getting used in sentences. That's all great. But then I also created my own stipulative definition for how I wanted to use the word in an essay of my own. So I was using it in a specific way, a unique way that was connected to how I felt and the point I was trying to make in my writing. So that's what we do with stipulative definitions. So you have to figure out what are the terms that I need to define. You can provide formal definitions, that's fine. You can give us several. But I would like to see at least one stipulative definition as well, if possible. Okay? And you need to define at least something, at least one word, at least one term, at least one concept. You have to find something that you can provide a definition for. And in some cases, if you are going to provide a formal definition, you might want to give us some of those other little factoids that go along with formal definitions, like I was just mentioning. Synonyms, antonyms, maybe even the etymology. Give us some more info so we can better understand the word. But the most fun way to use definition is to incorporate at least one stipulative definition of your own. You can also classify your two subjects in the intro paragraph. Tell us what larger categories or groups they belong to. This is pretty easy to do for most of the subjects that we are going to be using. For movies, we can always assign those movies to genres, right? To larger genres. These are both comedies. These are both horror films, whatever. We can do that with shows. We can do that with books. We can typically do that with music. We can always assign things to larger groups, larger categories. But when you're classifying, I would like you to think a little bit more about those larger groups, those larger classifications. What are some characteristics of the larger group to which your subjects belong? Right? So what are some things we can say about that group? What are some of the key characteristics of that group or category that your subjects share? Or you could also show us that maybe your subjects depart from some of the key characteristics of the genre or of the category in interesting ways. Maybe they seem to have a lot in common with other members of their group, but in fact, they are different in interesting or important ways. Whatever. You can have fun with classification. You can sort of push back against common classifications and say, actually, my subjects don't belong in this group where they are often classified. They belong somewhere else. Or maybe one of my subjects belongs over here and my other subject actually belongs in a different classification. In fact, you could build a good part of your argument around classification. That might be what you are trying to show us. That might be part of your larger point, part of your larger argument, that we need to reconsider our classification. We need to reconsider what group we assign these things to. That can be part of the evaluation. That can be part of the explanatory function that you're serving, whatever you want. But at the very least, you need to spend some time on classification. Talk about what larger group these belong to and give us a little bit more about the groups. And then establish your thesis. That's the final thing that you need to do in the intro paragraph. Once you've introduced your subjects, given us some definition and some classification, that might take a few sentences. Then you can give us a thesis. So your intro paragraph should be a little bit longer and more developed than the intro paragraphs that we wrote for Essay 1 and Essay 2, because we're doing multiple things. We're not just introducing quickly and then providing a thesis. There's that middle step where you are defining and classifying. Okay, so look at all three of my bullet points in my sample outline. And once you get down to that thesis, make sure it's argumentative. Okay, so by the time you're outlining, you should have already thought about your thesis a little bit. Maybe you have a rough draft of the thesis written down. Okay, maybe you're trying out a few different phrases, a few different sentences. Try to nail it down as the week progresses. But in the outline, you can still have a very rough version of your thesis. It does not have to be polished. It does not have to sound great. But you need to fill in that bullet point. Don't just write thesis coming soon. Go ahead and fill in at least an early version of your thesis. What is your point? Why do we care about your comparison? What are you going to show us? What kind of evaluation are you going to provide? What are you going to explain? What are you going to illustrate? What are you going to say? You have to have a larger purpose, and the comparison, all the data that you're collecting about these points of comparison will lead you to your larger point, to your overall argument. So make sure you have a thesis, and then you move on to the body paragraphs. And I've already talked about them a little bit. So again, just look at my examples. I'm going point by point. Remember, you can do that, or you can go subject by subject. But just make sure you're developing plenty of material. And you'll notice in my bodies, I'm using specific examples. That's essential. When we're moving through our points, we have to provide examples from both of our subjects. So if you are doing movies or shows or books, you really need to have those texts. A movie is a text in its own way. You need to have those texts handy. They need to be close by. You need to have access to them. So if you're going to pick two movies, make sure they are two movies that you have access to, or two shows. Make sure you have the right streaming device so you can access those shows. You don't have to rewatch them in their entirety, but it would probably be good to have them handy so you can rewatch bits and pieces so you can refresh your memory. And again, you need to get specific. So you might want to, look at a particular episode to get a better idea of what points of comparison you might want to use. And you also need to get specific with your examples. So you might want to point us to particular lines of dialogue or specific scenes, specific moments from these narratives. You don't want to be super general. You want to be able to point us to specific details. So it helps if you can flip back in the book or pull up an episode or the movie on your computer so you can refresh your memory and zero in on a few specific things that you can use. And if you're using if you're doing a couple of mechanical devices or technological devices or even foods, maybe get that stuff in front of you. Get specific. Pinpoint specific parts, specific elements. Again, not dissimilar to what we were doing in Essay 2. Break these subjects down. Let's think about individual parts, individual elements, because some of those might even function eventually as points of comparison. Certain elements that might be similar, somewhat similar in your two subjects, those could serve as points of comparison if you have similarities and differences that you can explore with those elements. So get specific and provide plenty of examples in your body paragraphs whenever it's appropriate. And also in those bodies, remember, if you need to do a little bit more classification, if you need to provide more definitions, that's fine. I want to see them at least, at minimum, I want to see those two in your intro paragraph. But if you incorporate them into your bodies as well, that's great. And like I said, maybe classification or definition will play a larger role in your thesis. And if you're making an argument at least partly based around classification or definition, obviously you'll need to be utilizing those strategies a lot throughout your bodies. So that's up to you, but at the very least, they need to be in your intro. They can also appear, though, in your bodies. So make sure you have at least 3, I would recommend 4 bodies for this assignment because it is a little bit longer. You see 4 in my sample, so I would shoot for 4 bodies, and then of course your intro and your conclusion. Once you get down to the conclusion, just make sure that you are restating your thesis, summarizing your main ideas, and then you can provide any final thoughts or observations. So the concluding paragraph can be pretty brief, but the intro should be well developed, a little bit longer than what we've done before, and then your bodies need to be well developed and detailed, but not too long. Remember, we don't want a single body to be much longer than a full page in a double-spaced Word doc. So it's fine, like I'm doing in my sample, it's fine if you have a lot to say about one of your points of comparison. It's fine to devote multiple bodies to that point of comparison. You don't have to cram everything into a single body. If you sense that the body is getting pretty long, pretty overstuffed, find a logical place to break it, and you can have 2 body paragraphs on that particular point of comparison. Okay, so if you have any questions about the outline or about the assignment in general, just get in touch with me. If you want to ask about your topics, your subjects, if you want to make sure they're going to work, you can email me and we can discuss those. And finally, let's just talk a little bit about post writing, because obviously I won't see you guys again before you submit. So again, try to stay roughly on my timetable. So if you have an outline by Wednesday, you then need to start working on a rough draft. And hopefully by the weekend, you have a completed draft. Not a final draft, but a completed rough draft that you can work with. You have all of your content, you're conducting your comparison, you have your thesis, you have your bodies, and once that rough draft is complete, use the weekend for post-writing, the third phase of the writing process. And don't forget that there are 2 steps to post-writing. First, we revise, and then we edit. So don't forget about those. A lot of us need to do a little bit more revising and editing. Revising allows you to clarify individual sentences and to strengthen individual paragraphs. So if you have sentences that are unclear, paragraphs that maybe aren't developed enough, they're not doing enough, maybe you want to rearrange the order of some things, tighten some things up, clarify some things. That's where revision comes in. And then the final step is, of course, editing. That's when we are eliminating obvious errors. Sentence level errors like punctuation, grammar and mechanics stuff, but also formatting errors. Make sure your heading is correct. Make sure you're double spacing the entire document. Make sure you don't have those pesky extra spaces in between paragraphs. Make sure you have page numbers. Make sure everything looks good in terms of the visual appearance of your paper. And if you guys notice in this week's module, I've posted a few of the things that I posted before. A sort of revision and formatting guide that I did back for Essay 1. I've reposted it this week if you need to use that. Page 3 of that document shows you a properly formatted essay following MLA formatting rules, so you might want to take a look at that. And I'm also giving you guys a few things that might help with editing. So we have that error checklist that I've posted. That's just common mistakes that I see in 101 papers, and I'm showing you guys how to fix some of those common sentence level mistakes. Stuff like run-ons, fragments, missing commas, comma splices, really basic stuff that we can fix pretty easily if we take the time to edit. So use all of my material that I've posted. Try to follow the writing process this week. If you want to send me a draft for review, you can do that, but I need rough drafts by Friday so I can give you feedback in time for you to make revisions and edits and submit by the end of the week. So if you want to send me a draft and get feedback on that draft, I need it by 5 p.m. on Friday, and I'm happy to look at those. Otherwise, good luck. Email me if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.